Well, thank you for joining WCAPS as we provide more insightful information into the student loan forgiveness space. I'm Adriana F. Mond, and I am joined by the incredible Bree Franklin of the Prosperity Project as we commemorate the anniversary of the hearings of the student loan forgiveness cases from February 2023 that led to the very public SCOTUS decisions in June. Bree, thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you for having me as your guest. I've been looking forward to this for a minute, so glad to finally dive in and get a good conversation going.
Yes. So this talk on the anniversary of the hearings will not be focused on things that have already happened, but more so on how to navigate the current environment that we're in regarding student loans, predatory lending practices, and payment plans, as well as how Bree found her way into providing financial literacy to the community. So with that said, can you tell us more about your background concerning this topic? What about student loan forgiveness brought you into this advocacy, and how did that lead into wanting to teach the community about financial literacy?
Yes, so I always like to say that this was a journey birthed out of my own very painful but real lived experience. So I am unfortunately no stranger to the perils of debt constraint. I came out of undergrad in 2017 with $100K in student loans to my name. And within about 2 years, that crept up to $116,000 because of, I always say, the two I's of interest as well as ignorance. And in addition to that, I also had wandered into other forms of debt just because I didn't have a very sound sense of financial instruction. You know, it was really left at make more than you spend and don't get a credit card until you have a full-time job. But since my teaching and coaching didn't really get more granular than that, it was very easy for me to still make naive, uneducated decisions. So at peak culmination in summer 2019, my debt ballooned to about $123,000. I say $123K, $609, and zero common sense. And it also resulted in credit backlash because my credit worthiness had taken a nosedive. I was so backlogged on my debt payments that it got reported to the credit bureau. And
Jeez.
if I can be perfectly honest, that didn't really rattle me so much as the fact that it also did the same to my dad and stepmom, who were co-signers on my loan balance accounts. And that created a lot of turmoil with them refinancing their mortgage. So just having lived every possible pain point that debt constraint comes with, especially as a Black woman and, you know, first time entrepreneur, first generation founder, all those other firsts, you know, that make it more challenging. It was very much something that I was passionate about and especially dialed in on once it started becoming a topic of national conversation.
Yeah, well, yes, all of that and above. So you mentioned interest and you also mentioned ignorance. And I have to be honest, like, I don't necessarily know all the terms that are applicable in this field. So taking it to like the elementary level, can you define predatory lending and what its connection to the student loan process looks like?
Yes, predatory lending is essentially the practice of allocating loan capital to a recipient who, like, with knowledge that the recipient is likely not in a position to be able to fulfill that loan obligation. So it's basically sussing out the most vulnerable, the most susceptible among our populations, which tend to be children and people of underrepresented backgrounds, and targeting them for loan accounts with the promises of, you know, what's to be gained, and just only painting a single narrative of all the perceived upside, but intentionally obscuring or downplaying any downside. And then there's also subprime lending, which even more nefariously looks at people who are high risk of default because they know they can jack the interest rates up beyond what someone with a high credit worthiness would sign up for. So it's basically just a very sinister, insidious revenue stream that a lot of bad actors have cashed in on.
Yeah, no. Okay. I feel like when I think about I'm like now looking at my debt so differently. And like, it's not a pretty picture. But when we think about our debt, especially student loans, like, can we apply the title of predatory loans to the government loans and private loans that go for education? Or is there like a different way that you would describe those?
Honestly, I have gotten to a place where I'm like, I can call a spade a spade. And I think, really what matters is the intent, not so much the initiator, but what is the purpose? Like, if a person is issuing a loan, are they doing it because they truly want to help that person use it as a bridge, as a means to an end, to get from point A of struggle and like being stuck in their circumstances to point B of experiencing prosperity, abundance, financial
Yeah.
upside. And unfortunately, I would say government and private entities alike are equally guilty of taking advantage because there's just so much money to be made and that has been made off of these types of financial vehicles over the years. And, when you deep dive to look at how this became a crisis, like student debt out the gate was not even grounds for concern. In fact, it used to be, I would say, particularly virtuous. And it was something that was universally perceived as a win,
Yeah.
because it was introduced in the GI Bill era. So following the war, there's an uptick in people who are looking to further their education because keeping in mind the context of that time, that was the only real way people could achieve upward mobility because the creator economy didn't exist, the internet didn't exist. So it's like you take away all these modern features, and going to college really was the only quote unquote way out and way up. But back then, it came with responsible conditions. So a borrower couldn't take out more than $1,000 per school year, which even adjusted for inflation in 2024 dollars, that's still no more than about 15, maybe 17K,
Yeah.
which is a lot more reasonable than the tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars people find themselves on the hook for. And as that took off and got a lot of momentum, then the bad actors that be decided, oh, we have something here. And so in the early 70s, the Student Loan Marketing Association, SLMA, branched off from under the federal government and became the privatized Sally Mae that we see all over
Mhm.
the headlines. And many of us, me especially and included, have gotten burned by. So it is, I would say, something that, predatory lending, the intent is really what is the dead ringer for what type of loan it actually is.
Yeah. I agree with that. I blame Sally Mae for a lot of this.
She she is on my blacklist.
Yeah,
I'm like, I
she is.
literally put down a life goal is to put them out of business before I die.
I think I think that is an admirable life goal. She is the originator of our discontent in this space. But
Hmm.
when we look at like governments and we look at private sector, we cannot detach that from universities. So
Hmm.
which way are the universities complicit in predatory lending practices? What forms and opacity do they use that can negatively impact first generation student of color and other low income students?
That was a wonderfully phrased question. Forms of opacity, because that is really at the heart and soul of how they've been able to get away with this metaphorical murder for so long. I would definitely say leveraging their reputation. There's just experts at marketing and branding. We've all heard about the Operation Varsity Blues scandal where all the celebrities were paying top dollar and bending over backwards to get their kids into the most illustrious, prestigious
College
institution,
Gate.
and the schools were perfectly complicit. And I remember watching that documentary on Netflix. I would highly recommend to anyone tuning in for this. It's very revealing. And someone put it perfectly when they were like, only a school with this much of a mastermind, convoluted scheme could make themselves out to be a victim, because they basically alleged that the parents were exploiting loopholes or taking advantage of them. And so poor us, we gain $10 million in the process, right? So it's, I would say, just creating these conditions to exist because when you really look at it, the schools are the ones who set these outrageous prices. And it's
Mhm.
because they have been unchecked and it's just being slipped under the rug because everyone's desensitize themselves to it and train themselves, brainwash themselves, I'd even argue, to give them a pass because it's connected to education. Like I've literally heard people, educated, brilliant people, who
Mhm.
have the nerve to say that student debt is, and I quote, not debt. they're like, no, I don't say like that's not debt. And I'm like, but that's just factually incorrect because
Yeah.
it still impacts your credit like real debt because it is. It still shows up on your credit score like real debt because it is. It still stands in the way of being able to build and save for wealth because it's an obstacle, past a certain threshold. And so the fact that schools have continuously made this system out of exploiting, they're working in low income background students, working middle class and below, and their families, when they're sitting on multi-million, in some cases, $1 billion endowments,
Mhm.
it's not right. And it's as I would say, slick and predatory as it gets. And so I think that there has to be to build on that opacity imagery, there has to be transparency. Like there has to be some sort of system that comes in to check that because while they are privately run and operated, there really have been no, like the government can't step in because it's a business, right?
Yep.
And so, or rather, it hasn't been able to, but I think that's where legislation is absolutely a must to be able to put a stop to this bad behavior.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the conversation that I had with one Eric Price II. If you have not watched that video, please go watch that interview with Eric. He was amazing. But he talked about something similar to what you did, and I coined it higher education bag culture.
Mm,
Um, because that's kind of what it is. That's what you guys are describing to a certain extent. Like we want to go to institutions that are so recognizable that regardless of what that sticker price is, oh, we'll deal with the debt later.
yeah.
Or to your point, people who are saying, oh, it's not really debt because it's for my education. It's going to feed into my career in the future when we all know that wages have not gone up.
They have not.
So
They most
speaking of
certainly.
how wages haven't gone up, how university prices have gone up and are just unregulated, said, how have you seen the lack of financial literacy or access to financial literacy impact your clients and how they engage with the results of predatory lending once they've left higher education?
Yes, I would say that predatory lending is a virus and debt constraint is the disease, and I think the lack of financial education is the perfect petri dish, for this virus to spread and to, just basically run amok. And
Yeah.
because people don't have that proper foundation, it really is a tolerance issue, especially among Black and Brown communities. It's like from conversations that I've been part of and then even seen play out in my family, it's like we have this just default of being owers instead of owners. And so we've just been hyper conditioned to always be paying somebody something, whether it's a car
Mm-hmm.
note, a credit card payment, a student loan, a mortgage, a payday loan. Like we unfortunately have just been, put through the ringer as far as being debt constrained and being on the hook. Whereas, in wealthier communities, debt is a tool. Like I won't say that there's no debt, but there is no debt constraint. Like that is the differentiating factor. When debt is properly leveraged, everyone loves to quote Mark Zuckerberg. How he took out $1 million loan for a property, and he makes money off the interest. Because the money that he is putting into the loan, like he's able to invest and then, put others into a high yield savings, something to that effect. But I'm like, everybody, like, this is not the same. He is not gambling his entire future and his entire savings for that loan. Like,
Mm-hmm.
that is a hair of a fraction of his overall net worth. The two are not the same. And
Yeah.
so I see just an over tolerance and just lack of discernment and I would say discretion, to be completely blunt. And I'm not putting blame because I know that this is the byproduct of years of, financial forces being played
Mm-hmm.
strategically against these communities. But it is time to snap out of that. Like just last night, I attended an event at Carnegie Hall for Black History Month. There are some major heavy hitters and wealth tycoons in the building. And one of them, I've run into him before. He threw an event in DC back in the fall. And then I met him one on one at an event not long after. And, his stance on debt is just, basically don't worry about it. He's like, focus on building your assets and then let that take care of your debt. And so last night he doubled down on that. He's like, I hear so many people, so many African Americans talking about get out of debt. And, no, like focus on investing and you could pay your debt at any time. And I just, it's like,
Oh,
I was like, I know he means well. I know he means well, but he could
so
not have missed the
detached.
mark more because he's now on the other side, like incredibly wealthy. I think his company's raised like a $90 million fund, something to that extent. And so it's easy to sit and be like, oh, psh, forget debt when you have cushion and excess and you have so
Mhm.
much. But I'm like, he's clearly ignorant to debt constraint and realizing that wealth building is just a conversation so many people are not in a position to entertain because there is so much more month than money, and they
Oh,
have more mouths to feed, and their bills continue to compound with interest. They've walked into predatory terms, and it literally hijacks their wealth building potential. So, I just feel like connecting that full circle to the question, it's really important that people become a lot more judicious and less susceptible to those traps, which starts with education.
first off, girl, you just preached the word. Okay. You said we are so used to being owers and not owners. And if that does not speak to how people of color came into this country, whether it was by transatlantic route or by boats coming up into New York, we came in to work for people. And we did not come in to own or to have our own in this space. Ooh, girl, I need a sermon. Um, because
That's
that
coming soon. Coming soon. That's
comes
gonna be a
because
whole message.
that will preach. Um, but when you think about all of these things and kind of how you enter the field, how you have worked to increase financial literacy, how you have worked to combat the idea that debt constraint is something that has to be a noose around our neck. What is one thing that you think everyone should know, recognize, or employ regarding specifically student loan and getting out of debt or, student loan forgiveness?
Yeah, I would really just say focus on the outcome. When I do a lot of talking to high schoolers and even current college students. And for me, it's paramount that I emphasize outcome based learning and not just saying, oh, go get an education at a 4 year degree because that's what everyone's always done and that's the only way to be someone. I
Mhm.
really encourage people to take a step back and focus on what actually matters. Like, what is it that the degree is supposed to allow them to achieve? If you're trying to go into medicine, go into law, by all means, right? Like that makes sense. But even then, if you have the ability and you can help it, research, scholarships, find grants, like do everything you can to offset that burden so that you're not forced to take out, especially God forbid, private loans, because at least with federal, they'll work with you. They've got flexible options. You can defer. They're a lot less punitive.
Yeah.
And even some people have had theirs forgiven successfully, whereas you'll never hear a story like that about private loans unless it was for a for-profit institution. But even that is more of a strike against the school as opposed to the financial lender.
Yeah.
So it's just really key for people to ask better questions and to update their thinking in 2024 around what it means to quote unquote be educated and to have a successful career. Because I see a lot of shaming, and I know that there are a lot of young people who wouldn't mind foregoing college or maybe even doing community college, but they don't want to be scolded by mom and dad and they don't want to be made out to be the black sheep of the family.
Mhm.
I come from a long lineage of college educated folks, parents, aunts, uncles, grandparents. And so, in my case, in my world, it most certainly was not an option to not entertain going to school. So, when my younger brother, decided that path wasn't for him and dropped out, it was just all the classic language being thrown his way, like he's going to ruin his life and he's setting himself up for failure and he's not going to ever make much money. And I always told him, I was like, your issue, like the fact that you didn't go to college is not a problem. It's the fact that no one cared or was willing to sit with you and help you find the next best alternate. because
Yeah.
and everyone he tried to consult with or go to for advice, all roads would lead back to re-enroll at Morehouse, like go back to school or, start fresh, go to community college. And it's just not a fit for everyone, point blank. Like so many people still are married to that traditional advice. And I say, forget that. I say, it has to be situational based on the person.
Mm-hmm.
And there's an acronym I've even created for this. For when I talk to high schoolers, it's called higher versus higher. So it's higher as in higher education versus HIRE, which stands for honor your skills and abilities, identify avenues for impact, research monetization methods, and evaluate ROI, return on educational investment.
Yeah.
Because that starts with you. Like that starts with honoring what you bring to the table, what you're gifted at, and then you move it through the stages and reverse engineer and you say, okay, if I am blessed in the capacity of medicine or law or engineering or something that necessitates a traditional education, then by all means take that road.
Yep.
But if you are more, someone that has musical abilities or you're a communicator, a journalist, or maybe you thrive in social content creation or marketing or vlogging, whatever that is, honor that, because now there's so many different mediums. There's the Google Career Certificate Program, online learning, so many
Mm-hmm.
free courses, Coursera, Udemy, YouTube. And I just
YouTube
feel like
University. My
yeah,
favorite school.
there's so much out there that is at your fingertips and can
Mm-hmm.
help really, set you up for a lasting, thriving career. So I know I'm getting a bit long-winded on it, but that is really what I would bring it down to is just take stock of where we are today and act accordingly.
I mean, I keep like, yes, I've said it in this interview and I also said it in the one with Eric, but like the bad culture of higher education. And for those of you who do not know, bad culture is the idea that you have to have luxury items when
Mm,
you're poor. Okay. What you doing with that $1,200 Louis Vuitton purse when rent is due? Um, And we do that a lot with higher education. We do that a lot in a lot of different sectors. And it's like, oh, well, my baby went to college. Look at her degree. We'll put it up on the wall and people can see it and see how proud I am of my child. To the other side of, well, you dropped out of school. Well, you ain't never going to be nothing, da, 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 da. That happens when you decide to choose an alternative path. And I mean, I don't think that's the case. First off, we're always going to need plumbers. If you don't want to go get a 4-year degree, please go get a trade. They start. The salary is like $50,000 a year. Most
mhm.
people who go to trade schools as opposed to going into higher education, for a 4-year degree, they've already made the equivalent of the debt that I've gained by the time I've graduated. So always look at non-traditional quote unquote paths because these things used to be the norm, right? We used to have shop in school. So people would go into more woodworking, more automotive, more trade type programs. And then we took it out because our education system changed. You can learn more about that in the interview with Eric. But as I said, over the course of the last 2 interviews, one with Eric, the other with Alpha, the information shared here will most certainly leave here and positively impact so many folks in this space, whether they're borrowers themselves or know someone who is. And with that, I want to pass it to you for any last words or wisdom that you would like to share.
Yes. Well, just again, thank you for the platform, for the opportunity to speak from the heart and completely transparently on the subject. I always appreciate being in spaces when I don't have to be guarded or, bearing in mind a certain point of view that might be pervasive among the audience. So I just really treasure conversations like these. I'm glad we're having them. I'm encouraged to see the work that you and your team are doing to give voice and life to this and just make sure that we're standing on a united front against some very real forces that are out to, keep holding us back and depleting us of the wealth that we've, as we know, worked so hard as collective in generations past to build and accumulate and pass down. So this is
Mm-hmm.
just very much something that makes me come alive and that I really enjoyed. So thank you again for having me.
Yes. Thank you again, Bree, for being here, for being amazing, for all of the information that you shared with us. And for those of you who tuned in, thank you so much. Thank y'all for enjoying this day-long series with different advocates in the student loan space. We've run the gamut of what information and resources we can lead you to positively impact how you engage with your educational debt, and we hope that you reach out to our partners like the Prosperity Project for resources and information. Bye for now.